YouTube, what's up? I've got a quick plug before we start. I've recently released my print store, which is shopdgh.com, where I'm selling modern prints that I've made over the past few years. Now, I've got a limited code for you guys to use, which is DGHYT, and it's going to give you 10% off of everything in the store for the next 7 days. So go over there and check it out. But for now, let's jump back into the video. Right, guys, so here is the design we're going to walk through. Now, I've tried to kind of define this into a named style, and it's a combination between grunge, horror, and brutalism. Now, I'm not going to nail it down because it doesn't matter too much, but this is the kind of thing we're going to be working towards. So I'm going to jump into a new canvas so we can go from there. Now, you're going to notice all of these kind of really strong, like high contrast textures that go on the whole way throughout the piece. So I'm going to walk you through how I've created these step by step. So if I come up to File, New, I'm going to set my width as 3840 and my height as 4800. So this is a standard for all of my poster design work, which you all know by now. So let's hit create here. Now, the first step I want to create when walking into a piece like this is you can see that there's a clear grid structure. Everything's quite well aligned and it's somewhat minimal in terms of typography and assets. So I'm going to come up to View and Guides here and select New Guide Layout. Now, this is the grid format we're going to be using. So we've got 7 columns here in 12 rows, and then just use a 50 pixel gutter and margin the whole way around. I'm going to set OK here. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to paste our image in, and I'm just going to use the center align tools and then go from there. So now this is an image I've sourced from Unsplash, which I thought had quite an interesting look. It's quite a fierce pose and you get a lot of attention drawn towards the eyes. And I think the contrast and the lighting in the image works really well to enhance that. So that's going to be the main focus. So my thought process behind this was isolate those eyes into a kind of a grid-like structure. And then that can be the high contrast area. So I'm going to open my grid lines up here and I'm just going to move them around or move the image around until I find a composition that I'd like to use. So I'm going to try and bring the eyes and part of the eyebrows into this kind of 2 rows just here. So let me kind of place it around this area and I think that is good for me. So now with the grid lines open again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a duplicate of our image here and we're going to save that. And now I'm going to come back onto our original. I'm going to press M for my marquee tool and I'm going to draw in this rectangle to the margins the whole way across the piece. And now on this new layer, I'm going to mask it. Now the reason is because to create this effect that we've got on the reference, I've simply just used a layer mask of a duplicate layer and then applied the effects to the outer one. So let's come back onto the original here. We're going to select the lower layer and we're going to come up to Filter and Filter Gallery. In this gallery, we're going to use 2 filters, which are going to be grain and glass. So I'm going to come down to this bottom area and I'm going to select New Effect Layer. And I'm going to delete the current ones we have. I'm going to make sure that this eyeball is checked here so that we can preview the effects in this area here. And I can play around my settings. So as I zoom in slightly, let me just zoom in on the image here so you get a better preview. If you use the texture tiny lens, you can see the effect that it creates. You can select frosted, just a bit more kind of like grungy and inconsistent. But for me, on this piece, I wanted to go for tiny lens because it's like quite fine detail. And now for distortion, I'm going to drive this up to the high teens. I kind of want quite a lot of distortion going on here. So when I zoom out, it's easier to preview at a large scale. And in smoothness, I can keep it where it is for the moment. You can play around with this to gather where you want it. I want it quite low so that I'm getting a lot of detail get brought out. So I'm going to go to around 3. And now to kind of draw out that fine detail, we're going to add in a grain. So I'm going to press plus at the bottom again. Now I'm going to come up to texture and select grain here. Now 40-50 on intensity and contrast is a pretty standard amount that I use when I use grain. So I'd always recommend these as base figures to use. So I'm just going to hit OK here. And now already we've got this nice mask created with this like grungy glass effect around the outside. And then the detail in the eyes being brought out through this mask. Now the next step on this is I also kind of wanted to create a bit of a blur effect to bring more attention towards the eyes in the center. So on our filter gallery layer, we're going to come to filter blur and Gaussian blur. And I'm going to set the radius around 50. And I'm going to make sure that this blur layer is dragged underneath the filter gallery so that we can still preview the effect. So now if I was to go back into this blur layer, we can adjust the value, increase it and decrease it how we like, and see how it affects the filter. I'm going to keep the value where it is around 50. That works for me. Now just to kind of enhance this contrast, I'm going to come onto our upper layer with the mask on. I'm going to select the mask itself, and then I'm going to come to Effects and Inner Glow. Now even just with this really subtle inner glow, it just adds a bit more of a direction for your eyes to look at, and it shows you the area that it is the primary focus here. Just add some more contrast between the blur and the unblurred. Now with the primary image effects done, we can just move on to typography now. So I'm just going to open up my grid lines and I'm going to add in the main title, which is just the word Deceptive. Now I thought the theme of this being deception would match really well with the image, which is the reasoning that I selected it, as I think the kind of eye of, you've got part of the face which is blurred out and kind of incomprehensible, and you've got the very clear, stern look. I think it mimics the vision very well. So I'm now going to use this typeface, which is BC Novatica, and I'm going to set the weight to light. I want to make sure that this is all lowercase, and then I'm just going to keep using the grids as a guide here. I'm just kind of using them to help structure my type and kind of decipher out the sizes that I'm going to use. So I'm just going to use this kind of like double column area here to create a good size for our heading. And now to create a little bit more obvious contrast in the type, I'm just going to highlight Deceptive here, and I'm going to change the weight to medium, which is 2 weights up. Now overall, I'm going to bring this tracking down a little bit. I'm going to put it -20 just to bring that in a little bit more. Actually, I'm just going to go for -10. And I'm actually going to make the heading slightly smaller. So I'm going to say about 50 is good for me here. Now in terms of typography here, we have this really wide rectangle going the whole way across the piece, which is kind of how I wanted to mimic the type layout. So I wanted a few paragraphs kind of dotted across this same horizontal line, just to keep this structure going. So I thought if I was to place my paragraph text kind of next to the title, side by side, so I'm going to make a text box just here, and I'm going to bring in my paragraph text. Now to generate this, I've used ChatGPT to just kind of develop an abstract story that can link to this image itself. So I'm going to adjust the size, do a few zoom outs, and see whether I think it's right. I might make it slightly smaller. I'm going to set it at 6. And I'm using Helvetica Now Display, which when you put everything in all caps, it just works very well unanimously across every design style. Now that this is formatted, let me just bring the text box in, shrink that up, and now I'm going to place it on the grid line below. And I think already this kind of contrast, this diagonal contrast between the type and the paragraph is great. Now I'm just going to duplicate this and add in our next paragraph. So just use these columns as your grid lines, and then I'm going to replace this with my next paragraph. And then remember, when you're formatting a lot of type like this, just grab your text layer, use Command J to duplicate, and then drag it down. It's going to save you so much time with formatting and resizing everything and making sure that it's placed correctly. It's way easier to do this. And now just to add in our final text box, I'm actually going to drag this one just over here. I'm going to just mess around with the placement, make sure that's lined up with the bottom of this. Just going to give it that really kind of clear horizontal structure. Okay, now if I zoom out here, I'm liking the look of this layout already. I think the white text works well. If you zoom in, it can be a little bit challenging to read, but we're going to add a layer mode on this. So with this kind of paragraph text here, I'm going to highlight all of our layers and then use Command G to group them. Then if I come onto layer modes, I'm going to set this to color dodge, and it's going to create almost, if you zoom in really close, it's going to add all of these kind of like digitized colors. Now from a distance, this looks great because it kind of creates this distressed grungy look already, which is what we're trying to aim for regardless. But it also helps with contrast. So for example, we're on the darker area here, kind of adjust the color slightly. But if this isn't working for you, you can just keep cycling between these layer modes. Normally difference and exclusion is going to help you when you're working between black and white, but it can depend. I know that because I've got the effect on, it can be different or a bit more challenging. But cycle through these, see what works for you. I think color dodge for this is what I'm going to use. Now, just to add a little bit more of this supporting text in to help the composition, I'm just going to type in my initials here, drag them onto this grid line, drag one slightly across, just name Deceptive, and then add one without the vowels. Now with these aren't always necessary. I know that this is what I've added in the original, so I'm going to keep them in just for the sake of the video. And now I'm going to drag these down to line them up with the bottom of this paragraph. Now it can just help adding a little bit more fine detail to the composition, and it's working with the structure because you can see this clear rectangle where all of the text is formatted in. So I'm just going to name this group paragraphs. Now with this kind of like grungy visual style, I wanted to add in a little bit of hand-drawn elements to kind of match it, giving you this like gritty look. So what I've done is, you can see on this bit of paper just here that I'm going to show you, I've just drawn out the word Deceptive a few times. I've used this whiteboard pen, it's just going to give these kind of like nice stray marks. And then I've scanned this in with my scanner, and I'm going to bring that file into Photoshop just here. I'm going to show you how I've blended it to fit it within the composition. So if I come onto the original, I've got this kind of like grungy look, kind of fading, distressed, Deceptive word just here that blends really well in with the texture. So if I just paste that into our new document here, you're going to see it's just a clear black and white scan of the paper I've drawn on. Now I've drawn out a few different options here. I was just playing around with the letter forms, and I thought this kind of like sharp looking D would work well, kind of keep it all on like an italic angle. So looking through these, I've clearly decided that this one is the best option, as this is kind of the best structured. So I'll just simply use the lasso tool here, and I'm going to just circle it and then mask it on my layer. Now with this mask, there's a simple way of counteracting the blending here. To remove the white, you just want to come onto effects and blending options. And I'm just going to drag my current layer white value down, and it's going to completely remove. Now you can create some cool options with this. Simply as if I just, notice as I just kind of drag it up and down, a lot of the text kind of disappears from within inside. So, if you're going for a particular style, there's a lot of variety you can create. I'm going to hold Option here just to split this slider to make it a little bit of a softer blend, keep as much of the detail as I can. And I'm going to settle with it just here. Now, once this is just been isolated without any of the white, I'm going to create a duplicate of this layer. Then I'm going to convert it to a smart object just to kind of set in these changes. Now with our text out, we can play around with the placement here. So I kind of wanted to just structure it over the Deceptive word already, but I wanted to keep this full stop visible. So I just play around with this kind of diagonally, Just drag it around, play with size as well. Kind of wanted to make it a little bit challenging to read both of them. So I think that kind of works into the theme of the poster. So this placement right here is good. And then I'm just going to add a color overlay on effects, and I'm going to make it a little bit of like a softer gray. Say about there is good for me. And say okay. There we go. Now all of the typography done. You know, from here you can play around with the elements and the placement. You know, use your grid lines, don't use your grid lines. I think if I was to check my original, you can see that I've not used the grid lines too strict here with our text. I've just used them as a guide. But now you're going to notice as well, behind all of this harsh texture, there's these kind of like faint, abstract, almost spiky looking lines coming out of the eyes. Now I've added this as kind of a bit more of a horror element. So the way I've done this is I've used Design Syndrome's tribal pack, which I will link in the description for you to use yourself. And I'm going to paste it into our new document here. Now this is it. It's just a vector tribal design pattern. And I've just played around with the placement here. You know, if you see, I've rotated it a little bit. And I wanted it to line up so that all of the lines are kind of coming out of the eye. You know, it's all giving you that direction. So I've just played around with the placement, maybe made the size a little bit bigger. And now from this point, I wanted to create a mask so that it's only visible outside of this rectangle. So it's very simple. Just command click on your previous mask we've created. And now I'm going to use Command, Shift and I to invert that selection. Then I'm going to hit mask here. And now you're going to notice we're going to have this rectangle isolated out of the mask so that we can have this tribal pattern viewed. Now, if I uncheck this chain just here, we can select our image layer and we can play around with placement without worrying about moving the mask. So from this point, you can just mess around, get it to just where you want it. I'm going to set it with it in this position for the time being. And now in terms of like keeping this comprehensive effect running through the whole piece, what I wanted to do was just mimic the same filter gallery options that we've used on the background layer and apply them to this. So I'm going to come onto our layer, I'm going to select filter and then filter gallery. Now this is already going to copy the previous patterns we've used, you know, give it a little bit of grain, and then we're going to also come onto filter and blur. I'm going to set this to around 30 so that it's still visible, but once we add on the textures, it's going to look a little bit more abstract. And now just to kind of match the contrast and the blending, I'm going to set the layer mode to exclusion. And I've simply just repeated these steps on another pattern here, which I'm going to bring in over the left eye. Now, exactly the same thing again, just command click on the mask we previously used, add that as a mask, set the layer mode to exclusion. And then we're going to come up to filter gallery. It's going to have those presets saved, so you can just hit enter straight away, add in a blur. And now this one's a little bit more visible just because of the nature of the contrast against the darker area of the background. So I'm going to bring the opacity down here. Now I'm going to settle around 40. I think that's perfect. And it brings in a little bit of detail over this text as well. Now I can just play around with the opacity of the other one, bring it to about 80 here. I say that's good. So I'm just going to set these into a group, just name it tribals, name this Deceptive. And now just before we move on to adding the texture layers, we can add these kind of texture effects onto the text himself. So I'm going to grab our paragraph section here, as well as our Deceptive text just there. And I'm going to select them both and duplicate and convert them to a smart object together. Now I'm going to hide the originals, make sure that this is set to color dodge, and I'm going to come on filter, distort and displace. I'm going to keep the scale around 10. I might actually bring it down to 5 just so it's a bit more subtle. And I'm going to be using this film dust texture that I will link in the video description as well. Now this is my standard go-to for every displacement map. It works so well on these grungy elements if you want to add a little bit of inconsistency to your text. Now bringing in our texture layer, this is from Texture Fabric. So now this is free and I'll link this in the description again. This is a great texture to use. Now because it is a little bit of a smaller file, we're going to be splitting it in half so that we can retain all of the detail. So I'm going to be using it in this bottom half area, and then I'm going to duplicate it and use it in this top half as well. So to begin with this bottom half, I'm going to extend it just so that we can't see those white lines. Set this to center align, and then I'm going to add a layer mask here, and I'm going to set our blending mode to overlay. Now this immediately is going to make everything quite dark, so we're going to play around with the levels. Now you're going to see this harsh white line from the edge of the texture layer, so we're going to softly blend this out. So just select your layer mask, press B to get your white brush, press X to swap to your black brush, and now we're going to just drag this across and remove that white line. Now this is going to create somewhat of a soft blend as well between this. So now we can play around with the levels now that we've got that white line removed. I'm also going to bring your opacity down slightly, let's say to around 80, just so we can see a little bit more light through the back of the piece. So now with your layer selected, use Command L. It's going to open up your levels tab. Now I'm going to bring in these darks a little bit, and I'm going to bring in the midtones towards that, just so we can bring out a bit more contrast within the texture. And that's going to create this, you know, this harsh look that you find in so much of this grunge work and brutalist work. Now look at this, you can see it all being brought out here. It's got this natural grain effect from the color dodge layer mode, and I'm going to settle with this for the moment. I think that looks quite good. Now with this texture layer locked in, we're going to duplicate that with Command J. I'm going to drag this up, and I'm going to flip it. Now, just so that we don't kind of like recycle the layer masks, because I don't want to make any mistakes, I'm going to remove it, and I'm just going to place this where I need it, maybe make it slightly smaller, and then add another layer mask. Once again, use your black brush and just remove that harsh white line. Now you may be thinking like, oh, these kind of like small sides here haven't really been covered by the texture. That's fine because we're going to add another one over the top. So simply, I'm going to duplicate this, remove the mask, and now this is when I'm going to make a large scale kind of big overlay over the top. So I'm going to center justify it and just make it bigger here. I'm going to bring the opacity just down a little bit so that we can still see these kind of like the contrast with the details. Now this text is looking really good. And if I just come into the levels here, I can play around with this a little bit more, see if I want to adjust my contrast. I'm going to bring the high values in just to bring a bit more detail out in the light areas, bring the mids across, bring those darks up a bit as well. And there we go. Now with all of these levels locked in, that is the final poster design. And you can see as I zoom in, we've got all of these kind of like grungy, gritty details, really nice photo scan that links in really well with the glass effect and all of this distress type on top of this. So that is the final design made. As always, guys, thank you so much for making it until the end of the video. I hope you could find it useful and that you learned something new about my process or something to add to your own arsenal. Now, YouTube is going to recommend you another video of mine just here that it thinks you need to watch. So go ahead and do that, and I'll see you over there.